The village of Arendor lay under a constant mist that clung to the hills and twisted trees like ghostly fingers. Its people whispered of dark things, of curses that walked in human form, and of a girl who had been born unable to hear. Her name was Ilara, and from the day she opened her eyes, the villagers had called her cursed. Her family, once noble, had fallen under shame and fear. Her father avoided strangers, his shoulders heavy with worry, while her mother moved quietly through the cold halls of their manor, speaking softly to Ilara in a language only she could understand. Gestures, touch, and the subtle expressions of love. In a world that prized speech, Ilara's silence made her a mystery, and mystery in Arendor was feared above all else. Even the wind seemed to shun her. It passed over the manor, carrying whispers of her presence, though no one dared speak them aloud. At night, Ilara would sit by the tall windows of her chamber, tracing the rain sliding down the glass with her fingers. She could not hear the storm, but she could feel its rhythm in the vibration of the walls and the pulse of the world outside. She had learned to live in a world of shadows and signs, of quiet observation and careful patience. But the village's whispers were not the only things that prowled the edges of her life. Far beyond the hills, in the mountains blackened with ice and stone, there was a power older than the kingdom itself. Kaelin, the alpha vampire, moved through the night with the confidence of one who ruled not only by strength, but by fear. Kings bowed before him, armies trembled at his name, and yet, in his endless life, he had never known fascination until he learned of the cursed girl in Arendor. It began with rumors, of course. Travelers spoke in hushed voices of a noble daughter who walked alone, who did not speak nor respond to the cries of men. Her silence was described as unnatural, a mark that even the old priests could not explain. And curiosity, that irresistible spark, drew Kaelin to the village's misty borders. On the night he arrived, the wind had died. Even the mist seemed to retreat, leaving the manor in an unnatural stillness. Kaelin watched from the shadows as Ilara moved through the courtyard, her steps deliberate, her eyes alert. She did not fear him, or perhaps she could not, for she had never known sound, and sound often carries threat. He stepped forward, and the darkness seemed to bend around him. Ilara noticed him immediately, not because of the chill he brought, but because of the weight of his presence. He was like a mountain moving silently in the night, a predator whose eyes held both danger and something else she could not name. Kaelin's lips curved slightly, not with malice, but with a curiosity he had long denied himself. She was small, fragile in appearance, yet there was a steadiness in her movements, a calm that unsettled him. It was rare to see such poise, such control in any living creature. And yet, she was human, fragile in the face of the world's cruelty. He followed her from the shadows as she moved through the manor. Her fingers traced the edges of door frames, her hand brushed against the worn wood, as if reading the story of her home through touch. Kaelin's fascination deepened. This girl, so quiet and so alert, seemed to see the world in ways he had forgotten. That night, a storm broke over the village. Lightning cut across the sky, illuminating the twisted trees of the courtyard and the manor's towers. Rain fell like silver threads, and Ilara stood at her window, watching patterns in the storm she could not hear, but could feel in the deep thrum of the earth. And then, something moved in the forest beyond the manor. A shadow darker than the night itself, with eyes that glowed faintly like coals in the dark. It was the forest spirit, the one whispered to have cursed the girl at birth. Ilara froze, sensing the weight of its gaze, the energy that seemed to pierce through the mist and into her bones. She did not speak. She could not. But her hands rose instinctively, a silent shield, a gesture of both defiance and fear. Kaelin stepped closer. Suddenly at her side, his presence a buffer against the spirit's cold stare. His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, yet filled with an unspoken promise. He would not let harm touch her. The forest spirit hissed, a sound that scraped against the edges of her mind, and vanished as quickly as it appeared, retreating into the depths of the misted forest. Ilara exhaled, a small movement unnoticed by Kalen, but enough to tell him she had survived the encounter. And in that moment, he realized something dangerous. He was not merely curious, he was invested. For the first time in centuries, he had found someone who could challenge the walls he had built around himself. The next morning, the manor was quiet, the storm leaving puddles like glass across the courtyard. Ilara moved through her day with careful grace, brushing dust from the furniture, tending the small garden that stubbornly grew despite the cold. Her family remained oblivious to Kalen's arrival, assuming the night had brought only more shadows. Kalen did not retreat. He stayed on the outskirts of the village, watching, learning. He observed the way Ilara's eyes followed the wind, the way she communicated with gestures that were at once precise and fluid. In his immortal life, he had never seen such a silent force, such a human so completely whole in her quiet. He began leaving small tokens near the manor, a ribbon from a distant land, a carved stone, a feather he had found in his travels. Ilara discovered them, her eyes widening at each gift, her fingers tracing the shapes and textures. She did not speak, but her gratitude was clear in the gentle movement of her hands. And Kalen, who had once ruled with fear and hunger, began to feel something else, the stirring of protectiveness, the warmth of curiosity, the thrill of connection. Yet the villagers' whispers continued. They called her cursed, doomed, unnatural. Some claimed to see shadows following her at night, others insisted that her silence could bring death to those who mocked her. Even as Kalen watched, he realized that danger was not just in the forests or the storm, but in the hearts of men who feared what they could not understand. Days passed, and the tension between them grew. Kalen remained unseen, a presence felt but not confronted. Ilara, sensing him, would sometimes pause and look toward the shadowed corners of her world. Their eyes would meet, and in that glance, a story unfolded. One of loneliness, fear, and the promise of something neither of them had dared to name. On the seventh night, Kalen finally entered the manor itself. Ilara did not run, though her pulse quickened. She had learned long ago that fear could be measured, that presence could be observed, and that the silence of one's mind could speak louder than any words. He spoke no words, for she could not hear them. Instead, he knelt slightly, allowing her to see him without threat. His hands were extended, open, a gesture of peace and respect. And in her own way, she responded, lifting her hands and brushing her fingers against his. The connection was simple, yet profound. In that touch, centuries of isolation, of curses and fear, of whispered rumors and shadowed glances began to dissolve. Kalen felt it first. A tug at his immortal heart, a pull he had never experienced. Ilara felt it too, the recognition of a power beyond her silence, a presence that was not there to dominate, but to understand. The night deepened, and the storm returned, though it felt different this time, less threatening, more alive. Outside, the mist swirled, and the trees whispered in voices only the wind could carry. But inside, in the quiet hall of the manor, something new had begun. A bond between the cursed girl and the feared vampire, fragile and unspoken, yet undeniable in its intensity. And just as they settled into the stillness, a figure moved beyond the manor's walls, a shadow with eyes like fire. The forest spirit had returned, its gaze fixed upon Ilara, and its intentions unreadable. Kalen felt the weight of centuries pressing against him, the hunger to protect clashing with the danger that awaited. He looked at Ilara, and though he could not speak her name aloud, he conveyed with a gesture, "I will not let it touch you." Ilara's hands pressed against his, and in that silent promise they both understood. The world was vast and filled with danger, but together they could face it. Yet the storm beyond the walls carried a warning, a whisper in the wind that neither of them could ignore. The curse is not gone. It waits. And the silence may yet hold more than either can bear. The mountains loomed like jagged teeth against the moonlit sky, their peaks hidden in swirls of mist. Kalen led Ilara along a narrow path, the forest around them silent save for the occasional rustle of leaves. The villagers' whispers had seemed small and distant, but in the shadow of these mountains, danger felt immediate and alive. Ilara's fingers brushed against the bark of the trees as they walked. The night air was cold against her skin, and she could feel the vibrations of distant creatures moving through the undergrowth. Kalen's presence beside her was steady, a warmth she could sense without needing words. She had learned to read the world through subtle signs, the tension in the air, the movement of shadows, the weight of a presence. With Kalen, she felt safe, though part of her remained wary of this being who had lived for centuries, feared by all. At last, they reached a castle carved into the mountainside, its dark spires reaching into the clouds. The walls seemed alive, etched with centuries of history and silent power. Kalen gestured toward the gates, and they opened without a sound, as though the castle itself recognized him. Inside, the halls were vast and dimly lit. Candles flickered in iron sconces, casting shadows that danced along the stone walls. Ilara's eyes widened at the grandeur, but also at the strange quiet. This was a world apart from her manor in the village, cold, majestic, and filled with whispers of something beyond human comprehension. Kalen did not speak, for her silence was his guide. Instead, he led her to a room with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out over the mountains. The walls were lined with books, artifacts, and relics from centuries long past. It smelled of old parchment, wood smoke, and something darker she could not name. Ilara stepped inside cautiously, her fingers brushing over the carved furniture. She could feel the history in the stone and wood, as if the castle itself remembered those who had walked its halls. Kalen followed silently, his gaze never leaving her, watching for the smallest sign of fear or discomfort. She settled near one of the windows, her hands tracing the patterns of frost that had formed overnight. Kalen approached and placed a hand gently on the sill beside her. She did not flinch. Instead, she lifted her own hand to meet his, their fingers brushing in a silent greeting. Words were unnecessary. They had already begun to understand one another. Days passed, each one a careful dance of trust and observation. Kalen showed her the halls and towers of his castle, introducing her to the quiet routines of the vampire world. There were other vampires here, noble and ancient, their eyes glinting with curiosity as they observed Ilara. She met them not with fear, but with calm confidence. Her silence, once a mark of vulnerability, became her strength. Kalen began to teach her in small ways, not of combat or the powers of the night, but of understanding the hidden currents of the world around her. He showed her how to sense movement before it happened, how to read the expressions and intentions of others, and how to anticipate danger. Ilara absorbed everything, her mind sharp and unyielding. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains and painted the sky in blood-red hues, a visitor arrived. The wind carried the scent of the forest, of rain-soaked leaves, and something more ominous, an energy that made even Kalen pause. Ilara sensed it immediately, her eyes narrowing as she stepped slightly in front of him, a silent warning. The visitor was not human. It was the forest spirit, the one whispered to have cursed her at birth. Its form was shifting and ethereal, glowing faintly in the fading light. Its eyes, like molten gold, fixed on Ilara. Kaelin's hand brushed hers in a reassuring gesture, and she relaxed only slightly, trusting him to protect her. The spirit moved closer, circling them both, its voice a whisper in the wind. Ilara could not hear it, but she felt its intent, malice, curiosity, a desire to test her strength. Kaelin stepped forward, his body a shield between her and the spirit. For the first time he spoke, though his voice was a low rumble. "It will not harm you," he said, his eyes never leaving the spirit. Ilara lifted her hand, touching his arm in a gesture of gratitude. She did not need words. He understood. The spirit recoiled slightly, as if surprised by her calm. It hissed, a sound like wind through broken glass, and then vanished into the mist. That night, Kaelin remained by her side as she slept. Though she did not speak, her presence spoke to him in ways words never could. He watched over her, feeling a strange mixture of protectiveness and something more, a pull at the part of him he had long buried beneath centuries of fear, hunger, and solitude. Ilara awoke before dawn, the castle quiet except for the soft stirrings of the night. She moved through the halls with the ease of someone who had begun to understand this new world. Kaelin followed silently, his eyes on her as always. There was trust here, but also a growing tension, unspoken and electric. She found a small library tucked in a shadowed corner of the castle, filled with books and scrolls that seemed ancient even by Kaelin's standards. Her fingers traced the spines, feeling the weight of knowledge and the history contained within. One scroll in particular caught her attention. It was old, written in a language she could not read, yet she felt the power emanating from it. Kaelin approached, sensing her interest. He bent slightly, his eyes scanning the text. "That is a record of your bloodline," he said softly. She could not hear him, but his words were carried through his gesture, the tilt of his head, the gentle pointing of his hand. Ilara understood. Her bloodline, once thought cursed, was tied to ancient powers she had yet to comprehend. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. The curse, she had been told, marked her for death, or disaster was, in truth, a hidden gift, one that required understanding and control. She felt the weight of it in her bones, and for the first time, she understood why Kaelin had come for her. Days turned into weeks, as Kaelin guided her through her newfound awareness. He taught her to sense energy, to recognize the subtle shifts of power in the castle, and to trust her instincts. Ilara's confidence grew, and with it, the bond between them deepened. She began to see the man behind the predator, the heart behind the legend. And Kaelin, in turn, began to see the strength behind her silence, the wisdom and courage she carried without a single word. Yet danger was never far. The castle's walls, though ancient and strong, could not keep out the outside world entirely. Rival vampires, drawn by Kaelin's growing attachment to Ilara, began to observe from afar, and the forest spirit, though repelled once, lingered in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. One evening, while they were in the tower overlooking the mountains, Ilara sensed movement below. She pointed toward the forest, her fingers trembling slightly. Kaelin followed her gaze and saw a group of shadowed figures moving with deliberate purpose. He narrowed his eyes, instincts flaring. "They have come for you," he said, the words more a warning than a statement. Ilara's heart quickened, though she did not panic. Instead, she touched his arm, a silent signal that she was ready to face whatever was coming. Kaelin's hand covered hers, the warmth of his presence steadying her, grounding her in a world that had been chaotic and dangerous. The night deepened, and the shadows below grew closer. Kaelin and Alara retreated to the inner sanctum of the castle, preparing for whatever might arrive. She moved with quiet determination. No longer the timid girl hidden in the manor's halls, but someone who understood that silence could be power and presence could be protection. As they waited, the wind shifted. A single branch struck the tower window, and a voice, carried faintly on the wind, whispered her name. Alara felt it, even without hearing it. The forest spirit had returned. Kaelin's grip on her hand tightened, and in that moment, both knew that the trials ahead would test not only their strength, but the bond that had begun to form between them. And as the moon rose high, casting silver light across the mountains, Alara and Kaelin stood together, silent yet unbroken, facing a threat that could not be met with words alone. In that quiet, they both understood a truth deeper than fear or anger. Their destinies were entwined, and the night had only just begun. The castle was quieter than usual that night. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at its walls, as if aware of the tension inside. Alara paced the length of her chamber, her fingers brushing over the smooth surfaces of the furniture. Though she could not hear the whispers of the world, she felt them, the vibrations of unease that carried through the stones and the floors. Something was coming, something older and more cunning than even Kaelin. Kaelin stood at the window, his eyes scanning the darkened mountains beyond. The shadows were thicker tonight, twisting unnaturally in the moonlight. His senses, sharpened over centuries, told him that the threat was not simply the forest spirit, nor rival vampires. It was something more deliberate, more dangerous. And it sought Alara. He did not turn to her, but she sensed him behind her. She had learned to read his presence as one reads the smallest details of a room, the weight in his shoulders, the tension in his fingers, the slight shift of his stance. She understood him in silence in ways words could never convey. Slowly, she stepped closer, her hand brushing his. His gaze softened slightly, and he allowed himself a brief moment of connection, their fingers entwined without the need for explanation. They did not speak. They did not need to. Silence had become their language. Later, as the night deepened, Kaelin led Alara through a hidden passage beneath the castle. The walls here were colder, damp with the touch of centuries, and lit only by faintly glowing crystals embedded in the stone. Alara's hand brushed along the walls, feeling the history embedded in the stone, tracing the paths of those who had walked before her. Kaelin followed closely, vigilant, every movement precise, every sense alert. They entered a chamber at the heart of the castle, circular and high-ceilinged, with strange symbols etched into the floor. Kaelin knelt and traced the carvings with his fingers. "This is where we can prepare," he gestured silently, indicating the space was meant for protection, for ritual, for defense. Alara knelt beside him, sensing the patterns not through sight alone, but through the vibrations that hummed beneath the stone floor. Kaelin began the process of teaching her how to harness her presence. He explained without words the importance of control, of focus, and of understanding energy. Alara absorbed it all with remarkable speed. She moved gracefully through the space, hands tracing invisible lines, senses reaching outward to detect any disturbance. Kaelin's dark eyes followed her every move, noting her precision, her courage, her growing confidence. Night after night, she learned. And night after night, their bond deepened, not through words, but through shared experience, shared danger, and the unspoken understanding of each other's strengths and fears. But the peace was not to last. One evening, as they trained in the chamber, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, a faint shimmer in the corner of the room. Then came the sound, not for Alara, who could not hear, but for Kaelin, whose senses picked up the tiniest ripple of movement. Shadows detached themselves from the walls and coalesced into shapes, figures of darkness that moved with intention. The forest spirit had returned, and it was not alone. Behind it came other entities, spirits of the forest bound by anger and malice, each one drawn by the power they sensed in Elara. Kalen moved swiftly, placing himself between Elara and the advancing figures. His hands were a shield, his presence a wall of power, but even he knew this was a threat that required more than strength. It required focus, precision, and trust. Elara stepped forward, her hands lifted in gestures that were both graceful and commanding. She traced patterns in the air, guided by instinct and by the lessons Kalen had shown her. The spirits recoiled at her presence, as if startled by the force of her inner strength. Kalen watched in awe. The girl they called cursed, the one whispered about in fear, was not powerless. She wielded her silence like a sword, her focus like a shield. The spirits hesitated, their malice unsure against the quiet force she projected. Kalen seized the moment, reinforcing her power with his own, guiding her without speaking. Together they created a barrier, a circle of energy that held the spirits at bay. The chamber shimmered faintly, the air charged with tension and power. When the last of the spirits withdrew into the shadows, Elara collapsed to her knees, exhausted but triumphant. Kalen knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. He understood immediately. Pride, relief, and something deeper. Something he had long denied himself. Care, affection, a desire to protect her beyond duty. The days that followed were quieter, but the lessons continued. Kalen showed her the history of her bloodline, the reason she had been misunderstood and feared. The curse was not a punishment, he explained through gestures and careful guidance, but a dormant power, a gift that needed understanding. Her silence had been mistaken for weakness, but in truth it allowed her to perceive the world differently, to sense things others could not. Elara's confidence grew, and with it, Kalen's admiration. He had ruled for centuries through fear, through strength and cunning, yet this girl, this silent, observing girl, taught him a different kind of power, a gentleness that was not weakness, a focus that was not naivety, and a courage that was steadfast and unwavering. One night, as they stood on the terrace overlooking the mountains, Elara sensed a presence moving in the forest below. She pointed, her fingers steady. Kalen followed her gaze and saw faint shadows among the trees, shapes that did not belong to the natural world. His eyes narrowed. Rivals? Spirits? Or both? He did not speak. He simply moved, signaling for her to follow him back inside. As they descended the tower stairs, a sudden coldness washed over the castle. The air grew thick with tension. Elara could feel it in her bones, a warning that danger was closer than before. Kalen's grip on her hand tightened, guiding her through the labyrinthine halls. They reached a room deep within the castle, one that even Kalen had rarely entered. It was an old library, filled with ancient texts and scrolls, and here Kalen revealed a truth she had not yet fully grasped. Her bloodline carried magic older than the kingdom, connected to the forest and to the shadows of the world. The curse they spoke of was a misinterpretation of that power, a misjudgment made by those too fearful to understand. Elara absorbed the revelation with quiet strength. She had always sensed something within her, a force she could not explain. Now she understood that her silence was not a mark of shame, but a channel for her power. Kalen's eyes met hers, and in that moment, he acknowledged a truth he had never admitted aloud. She was not merely a girl to be protected. She was his equal in courage and in spirit, and the world's dangers would only make their bond stronger. The forest spirit's influence, however, was far from gone. That night, as Alara slept, she dreamed of its glowing eyes and shifting form. She moved through the visions with determination, practicing the gestures and patterns she had learned. Kaelin remained beside her even in dreams, a silent guardian, feeling the weight of responsibility and connection deepen with every passing moment. Morning came, pale and cold, yet brighter than it had in many days. Alara rose and walked to the window, sensing the wind and the movement of the forest. She turned and found Kaelin watching her. He gestured for her to join him, and together they stepped onto the terrace. The mountains stretched before them, and for a moment there was peace. But neither could ignore the knowledge that threats remained, both from the shadows of the forest and the envy of those who desired Kaelin's power. The castle, their sanctuary, was a stage for the coming trials, and Alara would face them with courage, born of both human strength and the mysterious power within her. As the sun rose, painting the peaks with light, Kaelin reached for her hand once more. This time there was no hesitation, no need for guidance. Their fingers entwined, a silent vow that they would face the darkness together, that they would protect one another, and that whatever trials lay ahead, neither would stand alone. Yet even as they embraced this quiet promise, the forest beyond the mountains shifted. Shadows moved with purpose, unseen eyes watched their every motion, and a whisper carried on the wind, a reminder that the curse, though misunderstood, was not finished. It waited, patient and relentless, for the moment when the silence could no longer shield them from what was coming. Kaelin's dark eyes met hers, and for the first time, words were not needed at all. The bond between them was unspoken, unbroken, and ready to face whatever challenges the night would bring. And somewhere in the shadows, the forest spirit lingered, knowing that the girl it had once sought to doom might yet become the strongest force it had ever faced. The wind howled across the mountains, whipping through the towers of Kaelin's castle as if carrying voices from the distant past. Alara stood at the terrace, her fingers brushing the stone railing, feeling the vibrations of the world around her. Today, she would face the forest spirit once and for all. The creature had haunted her since birth, its presence a constant shadow, a test she could not ignore. Kaelin approached silently, as always, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. He did not speak. She would not need words. His hand brushed hers, a reminder that she was not alone. Alara nodded slightly, gratitude in her eyes, and together they stepped onto the path leading to the heart of the forest. The trees grew taller here, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. Mist clung to the ground, swirling around their feet. Alara could sense the spirit before she saw it, a pulse of energy, cold and sharp, slicing through the stillness. She held her hands before her, tracing the patterns she had learned, a silent shield of focus and will. Kaelin followed closely, his presence a wall of strength. Even he, with centuries of power, felt the chill of the spirit's gaze. It was more than anger. It was curiosity, challenge, and a test of both courage and understanding. He knew this was not a battle of brute force alone. Alara's power, her silence, her perception, her heart, would decide the outcome. The spirit emerged from the shadows, its form shifting like smoke, glowing faintly in the dim light. Its eyes fixed on Alara, golden and unyielding, and it moved with grace that belied the threat it carried. For the first time it spoke, though Alara could not hear the words. She felt them as vibrations, waves of intent that threatened to unbalance her. Fear flared, but she held steady, drawing strength from Kaelin's silent reassurance. She stepped forward, tracing her hands through the air, shaping patterns of energy she had felt but never seen. The forest spirit recoiled slightly, unaccustomed to her calm and focus. It hissed, a sound that would have been terrifying to a human ear. Yet Ilara's mind remained clear. She was no longer the frightened girl of the village. She was a force awakened, a presence the world could not ignore. Kalen placed his hand lightly on her shoulder, guiding her focus. Together, they became a single unit of energy, presence, and will. The spirit lunged forward, testing them, probing for weakness. Ilara responded instinctively, tracing symbols in the air, sending waves of quiet power that disrupted the creature's assault. Kalen reinforced her movements with his own, adding centuries of control and strength to her raw, untamed force. The forest spirit paused, sensing the unexpected harmony between them. It had expected fear, hesitation, and desperation. Instead, it found courage, calm, and unspoken trust. Ilara's silence, once thought to be a curse, was revealed as her greatest strength. She did not need to shout or cry. Her presence alone held power that even the spirit could not fully comprehend. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed in this tense dance, energy crackling between them. Finally, Ilara took a decisive step, lifting her hands high, and a wave of energy surged from her, a pulse of light and vibration that filled the clearing. The forest spirit staggered, unprepared for the force of her will, and then slowly, reluctantly, it bowed, its glowing eyes dimming as it retreated into the mist. Kalen exhaled, though she did not hear it. Relief washed over him, tempered by pride. He reached for her hand and she met his gaze, their silent communication more powerful than any words. She had faced the spirit and prevailed, not through strength alone, but through focus, courage, and understanding of her own gift. The mountains around them seemed to sigh in response. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean. The forest, once tense with malice, now hummed with quiet energy, as if acknowledging her victory. Kalen turned to her, placing both hands lightly on her shoulders. In his dark eyes, there was something she had not seen before. Admiration, respect, and something deeper, something akin to love. Ilara smiled softly, a small movement that conveyed gratitude, trust, and connection. She could feel the bond between them strengthened, unspoken yet undeniable. The curse of her birth, the whispers of the villagers, and the fear that had surrounded her for so long, all of it had been transformed into something new: power, confidence, and the recognition of her worth. Kalen guided her back toward the castle, their hands entwined, their presence a silent declaration. The halls, once imposing and filled with shadows, now felt like a home. Ilara moved through them with calm assurance, her fingers brushing the walls, tracing the carvings and the history that had once seemed overwhelming. Now she understood them, understood her place in this world, and understood the depth of the bond she shared with Kalen. In the following days, life settled into a new rhythm. Ilara continued to explore the castle, learning its secrets, practicing the control of her power, and growing in confidence with each passing moment. Kalen remained near, guiding her, teaching her, and respecting the space she required. Their relationship, built on trust and understanding, had deepened beyond words, anchored in shared experience and mutual respect. The other vampires of the castle, once wary and distant, began to regard her with curiosity and respect. They sensed the change, the transformation of a girl once called cursed into someone of remarkable strength and insight. Even Kalen's rivals, who had watched from afar, hesitated, recognizing that the bond between Ilara and Kalen was not merely affection, it was power, partnership, and an unbreakable unity. Yet the world beyond the mountains remained uncertain. Whispers of her victory over the forest spirits spread, reaching ears both human and supernatural. Some admired her courage, others coveted the power she now embodied. Kaelin and Alara knew that trials would come again, but for the first time, they felt ready. Not because they were fearless, but because they had learned to rely on one another, to communicate without words, and to trust in the strength of silence. One evening, as they stood on the terrace, the moon rising over the peaks, Alara lifted her hand, tracing patterns in the air, a ritual of focus and grounding she had developed. Kaelin watched, recognizing the discipline and skill she had cultivated. He reached for her hand, and together they formed a circle of presence, energy, and quiet power. The wind carried no threat that night, only the soft rustle of leaves and the faint whisper of the mountains. And in that moment, for the first time in centuries, Kaelin allowed himself to hope. Hope not just for victory, but for something more profound: connection, trust, and the possibility of love built not on fear or domination, but on mutual respect and understanding. Alara turned to him, her eyes bright in the moonlight. She could not speak, but he understood everything she meant. She had survived the curse, faced the forest spirit, and embraced her power. In her silence, she had found strength, clarity, and a bond that would endure. Kaelin's lips curved in a rare smile, and he lifted his hand to gently touch her cheek. Alara leaned into the gesture, her trust complete. Together, they faced the night, the mountains, and the uncertain world beyond, ready for whatever might come. And though the whispers of the forest and the shadow of the curse lingered at the edges of their lives, they had discovered something stronger, a bond unbroken by fear, unshaken by darkness, and resilient in the face of any threat. In silence, they had found voice. In darkness, they had found light. And in each other, they had found home. As the first light of dawn touched the peaks, Kaelin and Alara stood together, silent yet unafraid. The curse of the past had been transformed into a gift. The trials of the night had forged a bond of unmatched strength, and the future, though unknown, felt filled with promise. Whatever shadows remained, they would face them side by side, stronger together than apart. And somewhere, deep in the forest, the spirit watched, recognizing the change it could not undo. The girl it had sought to doom had become something far greater than even it had imagined. And the alpha vampire, for the first time in centuries, had found a companion worthy not only of survival, but of respect, trust, and the rarest gift of all: love.